The Caribbean heat clings to your skin as you walk along Havana's harbor in the mid-19th century, the air thick with the scent of molasses and salt. Ships line the docks, their sails furled, their holds crammed with sacks of sugar that gleam like golden treasure when caught by the sunlight. Cuba, the so-called Pearl of the Antilles, hums like a factory with one purpose: feeding Europe's and North America's sweet tooth. You can almost hear the crunch of sugar crystals between teeth, thousands of miles away, fueling economies far beyond the island. But here, the wealth flows into Spanish coffers. The colony has become Spain's jewel, its richest possession after the loss of nearly all its American empire, and you can sense the nervous pride in Madrid's clinging grip. Every sugarcane stalk swaying in the wind is a reminder of both prosperity and chains. Plantations sprawl across the Cuban countryside, their fields stretching further than the horizon seems to allow. If you step closer, the sweetness of sugar dissolves into sweat and misery. The work is relentless, sun up to sundown, with enslaved Africans bearing the brunt of labor under overseers' eyes. By the 1840s, nearly half of Cuba's population consists of enslaved men, women, and children, brought forcibly across the Atlantic to chop cane-stoke furnaces and keep the great sugar machine grinding. Slavery here lingers far longer than in many neighboring lands, making Cuba both modern in its economic power and archaic in its brutal reliance on human bondage. You can almost hear the whispers in the night prayers and songs of resilience floating out from quarters hidden among cane rows. Historians still argue whether Cuba's wealth made independence harder or easier. On one hand, the money gave local elites, many of them white Creole planters, too much to lose. Why risk rebellion when sugar profits made them among the richest landowners in the hemisphere? On the other hand, the very concentration of wealth and Madrid's firm refusal to share real political power only sharpened the sense of grievance. You feel the contradiction in every Havana salon where gentlemen sip coffee debating Spain's stingy reforms, and in every field where enslaved workers dream of breaking more than cane stalks. If you stroll past the governor's palace, you see Spanish soldiers in crisp uniforms standing guard, their muskets gleaming. They seem more ceremonial than menacing at first, but their presence is constant, a reminder that Spain rules here, not by persuasion, but by force. Cuba's wealth is too valuable, and after the humiliation of losing most of Latin America in the early 1800s, Madrid refuses to let this island slip away. Colonial officials send reports back to Spain, assuring the crown that Cuba is loyal, a word that papers over the bubbling unrest beneath the surface. A quirky yet telling tidbit: Havana in the mid-1800s was among the busiest ports in the entire world, second only to New York in terms of ships entering. Imagine that this island, smaller than Pennsylvania, turning into a global hub of trade, gossip, and politics, where foreign merchants and sailors swap tales about revolutions while sipping rum in smoky taverns. You can almost picture a Spanish official frowning at the growing cosmopolitan buzz, worried that too many outside ideas might seep into local minds. Spain tries to balance modernization with control, building railroads earlier in Cuba than in most of Spain itself, hoping to speed the sugar trade. The irony doesn't escape you: iron rails crisscrossing fields where enslaved people labor with machetes, the old world and the industrial age uneasily colliding. You can hear the whistle of a steam engine, sharp and urgent, cutting across the countryside like a metallic prophecy. Each train carries not only sugar to port, but also news whispers and ideas of liberty, cargo more dangerous to Spain than any weapon. Walking through Havana's cobbled streets, the cultural mix stuns you. African drums thrum softly in side alleys, blending with Spanish guitars from open balconies, and the scent of tobacco curls out of every cafe. Cuba is not merely a colony, but a crucible: Spanish law layered over African rhythms, Caribbean flavors, and whispers of an American republic just 90 miles away. From Havana, you can almost see Florida on a clear night, and with it, the temptation of another model, a country that broke free from European masters and built its own destiny. Whether Cubans envy or fear that example depends on who you ask. You can sense tension in every social class. Spanish-born peninsulares guard their privileges. Creole elites bristle at being treated as lesser free people of color, navigate fragile freedoms, and the enslaved majority endures in hope and defiance. All are locked together in an island where sugar is both lifeblood and curse. By the mid-19th century, Cuba's society is a powder keg wrapped in cane husks, waiting for a spark. Before we begin, if this little corner of calm has brought you any comfort, feel free to like the video and subscribe, only if it feels genuine to you. No pressure. I'd also love to hear from you. Just drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. It's always special to know we're all quietly gathered here from different corners of the world, like a family scattered but still connected. You drift deeper into the Havana evening, past flickering oil lamps that make the tiled facades glow with a soft warmth. In parlors and plazas, the hum of conversation grows sharper, layered with a frustration that is less hidden now. Creole elites, those born in Cuba of European descent, sit on carved wooden chairs, sipping thick coffee and debating with furrowed brows. They are wealthy, often more so than their counterparts in Spain, yet still treated like second-class subjects by Madrid. You feel their indignation in the way they adjust their cravats, their voices rising when talk turns to politics. They send their sons to be educated in Europe, they cultivate the sugar fortunes that keep Spain's economy afloat, and yet they cannot govern their own island. It is like being told you are the crown jewel in a monarch's diadem, but forbidden from shining on your own. The reform movement of the mid-19th century is not yet revolutionary, though its undertones are clear. Leaders call for representation in the Cortes Spain's parliament, or at least a degree of autonomy to manage Cuba's affairs. You hear murmurs of constitutional reform, of liberal winds blowing from Europe and the Americas alike, and yet each time these petitions cross the Atlantic, Madrid dismisses them with the same blend of arrogance and fear. Spain worries that even modest reforms would open the door to separatism, and once opened, the door may never close. Historians still argue whether Madrid's intransigence was the fatal error that doomed its rule. Some suggest reforms might have kept Cuba content, while others believe independence was inevitable, merely delayed. Beyond elite circles, the simmer of change reaches broader society. The enslaved majority listens for echoes of abolition debates coming from Europe, from Britain's example, from Haiti's successful revolt decades earlier. There is fear too. Planters dread a Haitian-style uprising where machetes carve through fields and society alike. That dread haunts every plantation owner, the vision of sugarcane fields not swaying gently, but burning in waves of rebellion. Ironically, the very wealth that Spain and the Creole class prize also makes the island perpetually fragile for a system built on coerced labor teeters, always on the edge of collapse. You catch an unusual anecdote that says a great deal in 1851, a Venezuelan adventurer named Narciso Lopez actually designed a flag for Cuban independence, a lone star set against blue and white stripes, with a red triangle that you'd recognize today as Cuba's national flag. He raised it during his ill-fated filibustering expeditions, hoping to rally Cubans to revolt. Though Lopez was captured and executed, his banner endured, fluttering as a symbol that outlived the man. The irony is striking. You can almost see him hoisting the fabric, perhaps thinking it would be forgotten in days, never realizing it would one day drape every government building in a free Havana. Meanwhile, whispers of reform intertwine with whispers of annexation. Some Cuban elites, particularly those tied to US markets, toy with the idea of joining the United States, believing it might safeguard their wealth and end slavery more gradually. You imagine the clandestine meetings in smoky backrooms where men sketch out futures for Cuba under different flags. Of course, the US itself is divided, with Southern politicians eyeing Cuba as another potential slaveholding territory, while others argue against such expansion. The island, once simply Spain's jewel, now becomes a chess piece on a transatlantic board, courted, resisted, and dreamed of by powers near and far. Yet ordinary Cubans begin to craft a different vision. In towns and rural gatherings, ideas of independence seep into conversations not as abstract philosophy, but as lived desire. Songs, poems, and stories carry themes of dignity and freedom, sometimes coded, sometimes overt. If you lean close, you can hear them, verses whispered in taverns or sung under the stars, words that blur the line between entertainment and rebellion. These cultural stirrings, subtle and resilient, lay the emotional groundwork for what political debates alone cannot ignite. Walking through the countryside, you see the contradictions everywhere. Spanish troops patrol dusty roads guarding against insurrection, while just beyond them small circles of locals plot how to rid the island of those very soldiers. Havana's theatres stage European operas, while in back alleys, African rhythms fuse with Spanish lyrics, creating music that carries rebellion in its very beat. The island feels like a pot left too long on a stove, its lid rattling as pressure builds. Even in Madrid, politicians argue endlessly over Cuba. Some see it as Spain's final hope to maintain imperial prestige, others as a costly burden. You can picture parliamentary debates where men in suits gesture wildly, their voices rising about sugar tariffs, trade rights, and the island's fate. Yet in the end, decisions drift toward repression rather than reform, as if trying to hold water in a sieve with clenched fists. It is easy to imagine that if you stood on a Havana balcony in the 1850s watching the sunset stain the sky red over the harbor, you would sense the weight of inevitability. Something has to give. Whether through reform, rebellion, or catastrophe, Cuba cannot remain forever locked in this gilded cage. And as the drums, songs, and debates rise together into the humid air, you realize you are listening not to idle talk, but to the first tremors of a much larger quake. The first crack of musket fire echoes through the Cuban countryside in October 1868, shattering the humid silence that had so long hung over the island. You can almost smell the gunpowder drifting over sugar fields as a group of Creole planters, small farmers, freedmen and enslaved workers, rise up in what becomes known as the 10 Years' War. At its heart is Carlos Manuel de Céspedes, a lawyer and plantation owner who makes a choice that feels both daring and inevitable. He frees his own enslaved workers and calls on them to join him in arms. You picture him standing before them, a tall figure in a wide-brimmed hat, his words heavy with both hope and risk. That moment, the Grito de Yara becomes the spark that ignites a decade of struggle, machetes flashing in the sun alongside worn-out rifles. The war is brutal and uneven. Spain commands professional soldiers, artillery, and supplies ferried across the Atlantic, while rebels rely on guerrilla tactics and intimate knowledge of the land. You march with them through forests dense with saber trees, the buzz of insects constant, your boots sinking into mud. The machete, a farmer's tool, becomes a weapon of defiance, slashing through cane by day and through enemy lines by night. This is a people's war, patched together by necessity, fueled not by stockpiles of gunpowder, but by the sheer conviction that Cuba's destiny must shift. Yet you notice fractures within the rebellion. Creole elites want greater autonomy and protection of their property, while many Afro-Cuban fighters yearn not only for independence, but for complete abolition of slavery and genuine equality. Historians still argue whether this division weakened the movement fatally or simply reflected the growing pains of a society trying to imagine freedom in real time. Either way, you sense that beneath the united cry for independence, there are many voices, sometimes harmonizing, sometimes clashing. The Spanish response is ferocious. Columns of soldiers march through the countryside, burning crops, executing suspected rebels, and trying to starve guerrillas into submission. Towns fill with refugees. The air grows thick with both smoke and hunger. Imagine families huddled under makeshift shelters, the taste of ash lingering on every meal while soldiers parade captured rebels through villages as a warning. And yet for every blow struck, new fighters seem to emerge. Hope is stubborn here, rising like weeds through cracked stone. One quirky but fascinating detail: some Cuban rebels wore simple medallions inscribed with the words Independencia o Muerte, independence, or death. They weren't finely crafted, often just scraps of metal hammered into shape, but the sight of them glinting in the sun, pinned to sweat-stained shirts, gave the fighters a strange aura of invincibility, as if those two words themselves could ward off bullets. You imagine the half-smile of a weary fighter tapping his medallion before charging into another skirmish. International attention flickers toward Cuba during these years, though often distracted by other crises. Exile communities in the United States, especially in Key West and New York, raise money and ship supplies while Spain tightens its grip. In Havana, colonial authorities build up their fortifications, turning the capital into a guarded citadel. If you stroll through its streets, the contrast is jarring. Cafes still serve chocolate and sweet pastries. Theatres still stage European plays, even as the countryside bleeds. It's as though two Cubas exist at once, one burning, one pretending all is normal. By the mid-1870s, exhaustion seeps into every corner. Fields lie abandoned, families are fractured, and the dream of victory flickers but does not die. Leaders like Ignacio Agramonte, a brilliant cavalry commander, give their lives to the cause, becoming martyrs whose names will echo long after. You can almost hear the hoofbeats of his horse across the plains. Each charge carrying more than a soldier, it carried a symbol. His death in 1873 shakes morale, yet the war limps on stubborn and unresolved. Spain, meanwhile, experiments with half measures, a gradual abolition of slavery, some concessions, promises of reform. It's as if Madrid hopes to bleed the rebellion dry with time rather than crush it outright. And slowly, painfully, the rebels realize they cannot win, not yet. In 1878, after 10 long years, the Treaty of Zanjón is signed. Many leaders reluctantly agree, laying down arms in exchange for amnesty and modest reforms. Standing in the smoky halls where the treaty is inked, you can almost hear the pens scratching the silence, heavy with defeat and bitterness. Still, not everyone surrenders. A faction of diehards refuses to yield, carrying on what is called the Little War, shortly after, though it too sputters out. The lesson, however, is carved. Deep independence will not come cheaply, but neither will it vanish from the Cuban imagination. The machetes may be sheathed, the banners rolled up, yet the dream remains restless, waiting for another chance. You walk away from this chapter of Cuban history with a sense of haunting resilience. For a decade, ordinary people stood against an empire, endured hunger, division, and unimaginable hardship, and though they did not win, they refused to be forgotten. In their wake, they leave a legacy of determination that will smolder until it blazes again. The ink on the Treaty of Zanjón has barely dried, and already you can feel the uneasy silence it casts across Cuba. The year is 1878, and after 10 grueling years of machetes, muskets, and muddy campaigns, rebels and colonizers alike are exhausted. You can almost hear the sigh of relief in Havana's drawing rooms, where wealthy families imagine the island returning to the steady rhythm of sugar profits and evening promenades along the Malecón. Yet if you wander beyond the capital, into villages still scarred by burned fields and empty homes, the treaty tastes more like ash than peace. It promised reforms, some token representation, gradual abolition, amnesty for rebels, but to many it feels like a betrayal, a compromise that stopped just short of freedom. You sense this disillusionment most sharply among the fighters who had given everything. Veterans returned to their homes with little more than their worn machetes, carrying scars of body and spirit. They had marched under banners declaring Independencia o Muerte, only to lay those banners down for what a vague promise that slavery would eventually be abolished, that Creoles might someday have more say in governance. Historians still argue whether the Treaty of Zanjón was a pragmatic pause that saved lives or a cowardly retreat that wasted sacrifice. Either way, the countryside hums with bitterness, a quiet recognition that Spain's grip, though bloodied, remains unbroken. Slavery itself lingers as one of the treaty's most glaring contradictions. While Madrid agrees to phase it out, many planters cling desperately to the institution, unwilling to release the very system that built their fortunes. You picture families who fought beside Céspedes, believing freedom for the enslaved was a central cause, only to see chains remain fastened years longer. The irony is cruel. Abolition was promised as a reward for peace rather than won through war. If you listen carefully, you can almost hear the murmurs of the freedmen and enslaved alike. How much longer must they wait for liberty already earned in blood? Some rebels simply refuse to accept this outcome. The Little War erupts between 1879 and 1880, a short-lived attempt by diehards to reignite the fight. Though underfunded and quickly suppressed, it reveals a truth no treaty can erase. Cuban independence has moved from fantasy to inevitability, even if delayed. Each uprising plants seeds for the next, the memory of resistance passed like a torch. A soldier hiding in the hills, scribbling letters by candlelight, cannot know that his defiance will inspire another generation. But you, looking back, can trace the embers' glow across decades. Meanwhile, Havana tries to project normalcy. Theaters reopen, cafes bustle, European fashions parade through narrow streets. Yet beneath the surface, tension lingers like humidity. The Spanish authorities celebrate the treaty as proof of loyalty, raising toasts under chandeliers while quietly strengthening fortifications and expanding the military garrisons. The duality is surreal. Polite waltzes echo in city halls even as rural families still bury the war, dead in silence. It is as though the island wears a mask, smiling politely while its jaw clenches unseen. A quirky but telling detail from this period: Cuban veterans, though defeated, often continued to carry their machetes openly in public as walking sticks. It was partly practical, partly symbolic, as if to say, we may walk today, but we can march again tomorrow. Imagine strolling down a Havana street, tipping your hat to a man whose limp is hidden behind that casual lean on a blade, one tool, two purposes, both farm and battlefield. The sight must have made Spanish officials uneasy, though they dared not forbid it outright. Beyond Cuba, exile communities in the United States, especially in Key West and Tampa, keep the flame alive. Workers in cigar factories roll tobacco leaves while listening to lectors, men who read aloud newspapers, novels, and patriotic tracts. Between the rustle of dried leaves and the steady cadence of words, revolution is rehearsed in whispers and smoke. You can almost smell the mingling of ink, sweat, and tobacco as Martí's future writings begin to echo in these halls. Though the 10 Years' War ends in compromise, the diaspora ensures the dream remains sharpened abroad. The uneasy peace drags on, but beneath its veneer, contradictions fester. Spain abolishes slavery in 1886, but by then resentment has already curdled into a sense that nothing is granted willingly, it must be seized. Political reforms remain cosmetic, a sprinkle of representation in Madrid, but no real power on the island. Every Cuban who lived through the 10 Years' War understands now more clearly than ever that Spain will not relinquish control without being forced. And so you leave this moment in history, standing on a Havana street corner in the 1880s, the sound of horse-drawn carriages clattering past, and you realize the island is holding its breath. Outwardly, peace prevails. Inwardly, memory festers. The machetes turned into walking sticks, the veterans blending back into daily life, the cigar smoke curling into whispers of unfinished battles, all remind you that treaties can silence muskets but not erase dreams. The war may be over, but the story of Cuba's independence has only paused, not ended. You find yourself in the back room of a dimly lit cafe in New York City during the 1880s, the air thick with cigar smoke and the murmur of Spanish mingling with English. Here, far from Havana's plazas and sugar estates, a different kind of battle is being waged, a battle of words, money, and imagination. Cuban exiles scattered across the United States, Mexico, and even Spain itself gather to plot a future unchained from Madrid. At the heart of it all is José Martí, whose sharp eyes and restless hands sketch ideas across scraps of paper, speeches and articles. If you lean closer, you can almost hear the urgency in his voice. Freedom is not just a dream to be postponed, but a duty to be seized. Martí is unlike many who came before him. He is not a planter protecting an estate, nor a soldier leading cavalry charges across the plains, but a poet, journalist, and thinker. You sense immediately that his weapon is language, and he wields it like a blade honed on exile's sorrow. Having spent years in Spain as a political prisoner and then in the United States, he knows both the depths of colonial oppression and the dangers of foreign powers who eye Cuba with hungry interest. His writings flow with passion and precision, warning Cubans not to trade one master for another. Historians still argue whether Martí foresaw too clearly the coming shadow of US intervention, or whether he was simply haunted by the ghosts of earlier compromises, but either way, his words carry the weight of prophecy. You walk with Martí through the streets of Tampa, where cigar factories thrum like beating hearts of revolution. Inside, lectores read his essays aloud to workers, their voices carrying over the steady rhythm of rolling leaves. The workers, many poor and recently arrived from Cuba, nod, murmur, and sometimes cheer softly as they hear Martí's call to unity across race and class. For him, independence is not just about ending Spain's rule, it is about forging a Cuba where black and white, rich and poor, stand as equals. That radical insistence on inclusivity sets him apart from earlier leaders whose visions were often narrower. You can feel the workers' tired hands quicken on the tobacco leaves as Martí's words breathe fire into weary muscles. Meanwhile, exiles pool money in whatever ways they can. Some donate from meager wages, others organize raffles or performances, the proceeds funneled into a war chest for the next uprising. In dingy boarding houses, maps of Cuba are unrolled, strategies whispered, and networks formed. It is rebellion reborn not in the open fields of Camagüey, but in the quiet persistence of diaspora communities. A quirky but vivid detail in Key West Cuban patriots once staged plays in makeshift theaters, the dialogue deliberately laced with revolutionary themes. Audiences would laugh, weep, and secretly pledge themselves anew to the cause, turning art into both entertainment and agitation. The Spanish authorities, of course, keep watch. Spies slip into meetings, dispatches sail back across the Atlantic, warning Madrid of Martí's growing influence. And yet what can they do? Exiles are beyond the reach of Spanish bayonets, and ideas are harder to stamp out than men. You sense the frustration of colonial officials reading Martí's words in smuggled pamphlets, knowing that every page, slipped past their censors, is another spark in the dry tinder of Cuban resentment. Martí himself is tireless but fragile. He battles illness, financial hardship, and the loneliness of exile, yet his resolve only deepens. He helps found the Cuban Revolutionary Party in 1892, its aim clear and uncompromising: to organize and fund a final war of independence. He speaks at rallies, his voice rising with a blend of reason and fervor, painting pictures of a free Cuba so vivid that listeners swear they can already see the flag fluttering over Havana. If you close your eyes, you too can glimpse it, colors bright against the Caribbean sky, carried on the wind of his conviction. Not everyone agrees with Martí's vision, of course. Some elites still cling to dreams of annexation by the United States. Others fear the social upheaval of a truly inclusive republic. Even among patriots, divisions persist over strategy, leadership, and timing. But Martí's genius lies in weaving disparate threads together into one cloth. He insists that Cuba's struggle is not only against Spain, but for the soul of the nation itself, a battle to create something new and just. You feel in his urgency a man racing against time, against his own frail body, against the risk that history might pass Cuba by once more. As the 1890s dawn, Martí's networks hum with activity. Ships are prepared in secret arms, purchased alliances strengthened. From afar you can almost sense the island waiting restless after its uneasy peace. The veterans of the 10 Years' War are older now, some limping, some bent with age, but their memories remain sharp. When Martí's call reaches them, they will know what to do. The machetes, those old companions, are waiting in the corners of huts, polished not for farming, but for fighting once more. So you leave Martí hunched over his desk in New York ink, staining his fingers, the lamp burning late into the night. His words, like sparks, leap across the water, lighting fires in Cuban hearts that Spain's soldiers cannot extinguish. The island may still be under the crown, but in the minds of its people, independence is already marching closer, step by step, word by word. The year is 1895, and the stillness of Cuban dawn is broken once more by the crack of rifles and the slash of machetes through cane. After years of exile planning and whispers carried across cigar factories and taverns, the island erupts into the War of Independence, a struggle fiercer and more desperate than any before. You can almost feel the tremor in the earth as rebels rally again, this time with José Martí himself returning to lead not from the safety of distant cafes, but from the very soil of his homeland. His presence electrifies the cause, his words turning into flesh and blood action. Yet fate, cruelly ironic, takes him quickly. He is killed in battle at Dos Rios in May 1895, a poet falling with sword in hand, his vision unfinished but unforgotten. His death shocks the movement, but it also transforms him into a martyr, the embodiment of Cuba's longing. The rebels, however, fight on. Leaders like Máximo Gómez, a Dominican general with decades of guerrilla experience, and Antonio Maceo, the brilliant Afro-Cuban commander known as the Bronze Titan, carry the war forward. You ride with their columns across plains and through forests watching, as they employ a tactic so simple yet devastating, the machete charge. Imagine waves of fighters storming Spanish lines, their blades flashing in the sun, their battle cries rolling like thunder. Against them, Spanish troops bristle with rifles and artillery, but they cannot match the ferocity or endurance of men fighting for the very soil beneath their feet. Spain responds with a brutality so sweeping it scars the island's soul. General Valeriano Weyler arrives and institutes the infamous policy of reconcentración. Rural populations are forced into guarded camps, stripped from their homes to starve guerrillas of support. You walk through these camps and the sight is unbearable: emaciated bodies, hollow eyes, children clinging to mothers with nothing left to give. Disease spreads faster than hunger can kill, and entire villages are erased, not by bullets, but by confinement. Historians still argue over the numbers, but some estimates suggest that hundreds of thousands perish in these reconcentration zones. And yet, in a bitter twist, the cruelty only strengthens the rebels' resolve and exposes Spain's desperation. Meanwhile, fields of sugar cane, once the proud engine of Cuba's wealth, are deliberately torched by rebels. You smell the smoke drifting across the island, black columns rising against the horizon. To starve Spain's profits, the land itself is sacrificed, a scorched offering for freedom. It is painful to imagine planters, rebels, and even ordinary farmers watching their livelihoods vanish in flames, but they accept it as the cost of strangling the colonial machine. The very sweetness of sugar, which had enslaved the island for centuries, now turns bitter in its destruction. A curious and often overlooked detail: rebel fighters living in rough camps in the wilderness, sometimes stitched together uniforms from whatever cloth they could find, fragments of US flags, scraps of Spanish fabric, even burlap sacks. The resulting appearance was ragged but symbolic, each piece sewn into jackets and caps carrying hidden meanings of defiance. You picture a fighter standing proudly in mismatched colors, his machete gleaming, embodying the idea that a uniform need not be neat to declare a nation's will. International attention begins to stir. Newspapers in the United States publish sensational stories of Spanish atrocities, their headlines screaming of Butcher Weyler and the suffering of Cuban civilians. In European salons, sympathy flickers, though few governments are eager to confront Spain. Still, the war has escaped the island's borders. It now lives in print, in speeches, in the imagination of outsiders who picture Cuba not merely as a distant colony, but as a bleeding neighbor. As the conflict stretches into the late 1890s, both sides reel under its weight. Spanish soldiers, often young conscripts, shipped unwillingly from rural villages in Spain, fight a war they do not believe in, their letters home filled with despair. Rebels hardened by years of deprivation remain elusive, their knowledge of the land turning every forest into a fortress. The island itself seems to groan beneath the struggle, its rivers fouled its fields, scarred its towns, emptied. Through it all, Martí's vision lingers like a ghost. His insistence on a Cuba that belongs to all Cubans, black, white, rich, poor, echoes in the rebel camps. When Maceo falls in 1896, cut down in battle, it feels as though the island loses another piece of its heart. Yet Gómez fights on, his weathered face set with the calm of a man who knows this war cannot be abandoned. You imagine him sitting by a fire at night, sketching strategies in the dirt, his eyes reflecting both fatigue and unyielding resolve. By 1897, Spain reels under both military strain and international condemnation. Havana remains in Spanish hands, but much of the countryside lies beyond their control. If you walk through those contested spaces, you sense both despair and hope intertwined. The people are suffering beyond measure, yet the dream of independence, so often deferred, burns hotter than ever before. You leave this chapter standing beneath a canopy of Cuban stars, the crackle of distant gunfire echoing across hills. Around you, weary fighters whisper Martí's words, clutching machetes that glint faintly in the moonlight. They know the cost of freedom has risen unbearably high, yet they march, still convinced that to surrender now would be to let the island itself die. By early 1898, the war raging across Cuba has become impossible for the outside world to ignore. You can feel the hum of attention buzzing far beyond the Caribbean into Washington newsrooms across European capitals and into the homes of ordinary Americans leafing through lurid headlines. U.S. newspapers, particularly those owned by William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, splash sensational stories of Spanish cruelty across their front pages. Starving children in reconcentration camps, women fainting in the streets, fields smouldering under Weyler's orders. Some of it is true, some exaggerated, and some wholly invented, but the impact is undeniable. Public opinion swells like a tide, and Cuba's suffering becomes America's daily drama. You sense the irony, an island struggling for its own voice, now spoken for in giant block letters by New York editors. The United States' interest in Cuba is not purely humanitarian, of course. If you stroll into the smoky chambers of Washington's political circles, you hear the whispers. Clearly, Cuba lies just 90 miles from Florida. Its sugar and tobacco promising wealth, its harbors promising strategic advantage. Many in Congress argue that instability so close to U.S. shores is intolerable. Businessmen eyeing Cuba's resources press for intervention, while others cloak ambition in the rhetoric of liberty. Historians still argue whether the US was motivated more by profit security or genuine sympathy for Cuban suffering. But one fact is certain: Cuba has become too important to ignore. The spark that lights the fuse comes in February 1898. The USS Maine, an American battleship sent to Havana Harbor as a show of protection, suddenly explodes, ripping open its steel hull and killing over 250 sailors. You picture the stunned silence across the city as the night sky glows with fire, the wreck settling into the harbor's waters. The cause is uncertain, perhaps a coal bunker fire, perhaps sabotage, but newspapers waste no time. Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain, splashes across headlines, a chant that rolls like thunder through American streets. For Cubans watching it, feels as though their struggle has just been hijacked by a power larger than Spain itself. Back on the island, the war grows ever bloodier. Spanish troops still hold Havana and key cities, but the countryside remains a patchwork of rebel strongholds. Starvation gnaws at civilians while disease ravages soldiers. The sound of gunfire drifts endlessly through cane fields, a grim background rhythm. Yet the rebels fight on their resolve, seemingly unbreakable, fueled now by the knowledge that world powers are circling overhead. Martí's warnings about foreign dominance echo eerily. You can almost hear his voice whispering, urging Cubans to guard against trading one master for another. One quirky and strangely poignant detail from these final months before U.S. intervention: Cuban rebels often rode horses festooned with improvised saddles made of palm fronds and bits of rope. Their ragtag appearance stood in stark contrast to the polished Spanish cavalry, yet the symbolism was striking: resourcefulness against rigidity, survival against pomp. You can imagine a weary fighter, reins in hand, grinning wryly at his rough mount, knowing that every charge struck fear, not because of finery, but because of fury. In Washington, debates rage, but momentum builds toward war. President McKinley, initially cautious, bows to public pressure, to the howling press, to Congress, and perhaps to his own strategic instincts. In April 1898, the U.S. declares war on Spain, formally aligning itself with Cuba's cause. For rebels who have bled for decades, it is a strange moment relief that Spain's empire may finally collapse, mixed with unease about what comes next. The first American soldiers land, their uniforms starched and clean, their rifles gleaming, a stark contrast to the ragged Cuban fighters who have survived years of deprivation. The two forces fight together uneasily, the Cubans often relegated to supporting roles while the US claims center stage. Yet without the rebels' knowledge of terrain, without the blood already shed in jungles and plains, the American campaign could never succeed. You walk alongside a Cuban veteran, watching US troops march past, and you sense his pride tinged with suspicion. Victory is near, but whose victory will it be? As spring turns to summer, the island quivers on the cusp of change. Spanish power is crumbling, US ships prowl the coasts, and rebel bands harry garrisons with relentless strikes. The dream of independence, so often deferred, so often betrayed, seems finally within reach. And yet, like the humid air heavy with storm clouds, unease lingers. The machetes have not rested for 3 decades. Can they truly be laid down now, or will a new struggle simply replace the old? The summer of 1898 is suffocating, and you can almost taste the heat as US troops disembark on Cuban soil boots, sinking into beaches that rebels have long stained with their blood. Spanish rule stretched thin and battered teeters like an old wall under the weight of a storm. The Cuban rebels, who have fought for 3 decades with machetes, ragged uniforms, and sheer resilience, suddenly find themselves joined by tens of thousands of fresh American soldiers. At first it feels like the arrival of an ally, but soon you sense the tension. This is not quite partnership, more like an overshadowing presence. The battles themselves unfold with dizzying speed. At Santiago, you see Cuban insurgents cut paths through jungles for American troops, guiding them across terrain they know by heart. You watch the iconic charge up San Juan Hill, later celebrated in American law with Theodore Roosevelt and his Rough Riders at the center. Yet the Cuban forces who flanked and weakened the Spanish defenses are barely mentioned. Historians still argue whether this erasure was deliberate myth-making or mere arrogance, but for the rebels the sting is sharp: to fight for decades, only to be treated as extras in someone else's story. Spain, already fragile, collapses under this dual assault. Its navy, once proud, is annihilated at Santiago Bay, the sound of shells echoing across the water as ships sink one by one. The empire that had once stretched across the Americas shrinks to a shadow, its final jewel slipping away. By August 1898, the war is effectively over. Spanish officials negotiate surrender, while Havana braces for occupation. You can picture Spanish officers, their uniforms faded and boots scuffed, lowering their flags with the weary dignity of men who know history has moved past them. Yet for Cubans, the victory feels hollow. On January 1st, 1899, the Spanish flag is lowered in Havana, but it is not the Cuban flag that rises, it is the stars and stripes. The cheers of independence are muffled, replaced by confusion and unease. After 30 years of sacrifice, freedom seems once again deferred. You stand among the crowd in Havana's Plaza de Armas, the US flag fluttering overhead, and you can feel the bitter irony: sting independence fought for by Cubans, claimed in ceremony by another. The Treaty of Paris, signed in December 1898, cements the outcome. Spain relinquishes Cuba but hands control to the United States as a protectorate. Cuba is not listed as an equal partner at the table, only as territory to be discussed. You imagine Cuban leaders, veterans and families alike reading the treaty with clenched fists, realizing that the battle may be won, but the war for dignity has simply shifted. The dream of Martí, of Maceo, of Gomez, an independent Cuba for Cubans, has been postponed yet again, this time under a different flag. A quirky but revealing detail from this transition: American soldiers unused to the tropical climate often bought straw hats from local vendors to replace their heavy military caps. Walking through Havana, you would see khaki uniforms topped with wide-brimmed Cuban hats, an almost comical sight, symbols of foreign authority dressed in the island's own garb. For locals watching, the absurdity barely softened the sting of occupation. The contradictions grow sharper in the months that follow. US officials promise they are only temporary stewards, that Cuba will eventually govern itself. But as military governors settle into Havana's grand buildings, as American businessmen buy up sugar mills and railroads, you cannot help but wonder whose independence this really is. The city buzzes with both relief that Spain is gone and suspicion that sovereignty has simply changed hands. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear Martí's warning echoing again to avoid being prey to the North that despises us. For the ordinary Cuban family, life remains precarious. The war has left fields barren, towns devastated, and thousands dead from famine and disease. Relief supplies trickle in, but rebuilding feels slow, uneven, and often dictated by foreign priorities. Veterans return to their homes expecting recognition land or even basic security, only to find themselves marginalized once more. Their machetes, polished by decades of fighting, now lean against walls as mute reminders that the struggle is unfinished. So here you stand at the turn of the century in a Havana both jubilant and restless. Fireworks may mark the end of Spanish rule, but in the shadows of the celebrations, Cubans whisper to each other that true independence has yet to arrive. The island has exchanged one empire's flag for another's shadow, and though the cannons have fallen silent, the question of who truly holds Cuba's destiny remains unanswered. The 20th century dawns with Cuba draped in a strange costume, outwardly free from Spain, inwardly tethered to the United States. You can feel the tension almost physically as you walk through Havana in 1901, where American military governors sit behind heavy desks drafting laws and shaping institutions, while Cuban leaders linger at the edges. The United States insists that Cuba is preparing for independence, yet in the same breath demands guarantees that will bind the island tightly. This contradiction crystallizes in the Platt Amendment, a clause tacked onto Cuba's new constitution that reads less like a roadmap to freedom and more like a leash. The Platt Amendment gives Washington sweeping powers the right to intervene in Cuban affairs whenever it deems necessary control over Cuba's foreign treaties and the leasing of land for naval bases, most infamously Guantanamo Bay. You picture Cuban delegates in the Constitutional Convention, some fuming, others resigned as the amendment is forced upon them under threat that U.S. troops will never leave otherwise. Historians still argue whether Cuban leaders accepted out of pragmatism, better to bend and survive, or sheer exhaustion after decades of war. Either way, the island's sovereignty is born, compromised its independence, shadowed by the stars and stripes. On paper, Cuba becomes a republic in 1902. Flags rise, bands play, parades wind through Havana's streets. You can almost hear the music echoing off stone facades, the cheers blending with tears. Tomás Estrada Palmer, a former exile and ally of Martí, is sworn in as the nation's first president. But even in the celebrations, unease lingers. U.S. officials attend the ceremonies like watchful guardians, their presence a reminder that Cuba's freedom is conditional. To the crowds waving flags, it is both a day of triumph and a day of reckoning independence. Yes, but independence with strings firmly attached. For ordinary Cubans, life in the early republic is a blend of hope and disillusionment. The countryside, scarred by 3 decades of war, slowly revives. Sugar mills roar back to life, their chimneys belching smoke, as cane once more dominates the economy. But much of that economy is now in foreign hands. American companies own vast swaths of land, controlling not just sugar, but railroads, banks, and utilities. You walk through Havana's business district and notice English signs sprouting alongside Spanish ones, the dollar whispering through every transaction. To many Cubans, it feels less like independence than exchange. Spain gone, America arrived. A quirky but telling detail during this era, American tourists begin flocking to Havana, drawn by its casinos, theaters, and tropical mystique. Guidebooks from the time gush about Cuba as an American playground, just a short steamship ride from Florida. Imagine strolling through a Havana hotel lobby where U.S. businessmen sip cocktails beside rebel veterans who once fought with machetes, 2 worlds colliding under the same palm trees. The absurdity is almost cinematic, a colony transformed into a resort before the wounds of war have even fully healed. Politics in the young republic proves fragile. Estrada Palmer's presidency starts cautiously emphasizing stability, but corruption and discontent soon seep in. By 1906, tensions erupt into rebellion, giving the United States its first excuse to exercise the Platt Amendment. Marines land once more, their boots echoing on Havana's cobblestones, and Washington assumes direct control, for nearly 3 years. For Cubans, the message is unmistakable. Their sovereignty exists only so long as it pleases their northern neighbor. You can feel the frustration simmering in every cafe conversation, every rural gathering. Veterans who dreamed of Martí's inclusive, self-determined republic mutter bitterly that the sacrifices of the wars have been betrayed. Farmers, still poor and often indebted, wonder whether the flags and parades changed anything at all. And yet amid the disillusionment, the Cuban spirit refuses to extinguish. Each intervention, each overreach by Washington plants a deeper determination that one day the island will not just be independent on paper but in truth. The contradictions are impossible to miss. Havana sparkles with electric lights, new theaters and bustling commerce, yet in the countryside, peasants labor in fields owned by foreign investors. American dollars fuel progress but also dependency. The Republic staggers forward, its steps guided and sometimes tripped by invisible strings pulled from Washington. Standing at the edge of a Havana street as the band plays a patriotic march, you realize the irony. Cuba is technically a republic, but its sovereignty is a performance staged under supervision. And so the early decades of the 20th century unfold as an uneasy dance. Cuba proud, yet constrained, resilient, yet restless, building a nation, while forever aware that its destiny is not fully its own. The machetes have been hung on walls, their blades polished by memory, but the question remains, will they one day be taken down again? You find yourself beneath the swaying palms of Havana in the early 20th century, where the Cuban flag flutters in the Caribbean breeze, a symbol both triumphant and troubled. Independence has been proclaimed, parades have marched, presidents have been sworn in, yet the air feels thick with a question. No celebration? Can silence? Is this the freedom so many bled for? The Republic exists, yes, but it wears a collar fastened by the Platt Amendment. Every Cuban knows that behind the tricolor flag stands the looming shadow of the United States, ready to intervene at will. You can almost hear Martí's voice whispering across the years, his warnings about exchanging one master for another, echoing against every decision made in Havana's halls of power. The early decades reveal the paradox clearly. On the one hand, schools expand cities, modernize Havana becomes a cosmopolitan jewel of the Caribbean, admired and envied for its theaters, lights and rhythm. On the other hand, the countryside remains poor, its people laboring under debts, their sweat enriching foreign companies. American businesses dominate sugar banking and even utilities. U.S. Marines return again in 1912 and 1917 to quash unrest, their presence, a constant reminder that sovereignty is provisional. Standing in a rural village, you see the weathered faces of veterans who once charged Spanish lines with machetes, now bending over cane fields owned by outsiders, their independence exchanged for wages barely enough to survive. And yet within this uneasy republic, a spirit persists. Poets and musicians sing of Cuba not as a playground for tourists, but as a nation of dignity. Afro-Cuban voices demand recognition, recalling Antonio Mateo's legacy. Workers organize strikes, students march, intellectuals write each act a reminder that Cuban identity is larger than any treaty or amendment. Historians still argue whether the Platt Amendment delayed the maturation of Cuban sovereignty or forced it to sharpen its teeth more fiercely. But one thing is certain, the island never stopped dreaming of full independence. There is a quirky detail you can't help but smile at. Throughout the early 1900s, veterans of the wars would gather in Havana's parks, their medals pinned proudly to faded jackets, their machetes polished like relics. Children would sit at their feet wide-eyed as the old men retold battles fought in jungles and plains. These stories, part history and part legend, became the inheritance of a younger generation. You imagine one child clutching a toy machete carved from wood, swearing silently to live up to the legacy of Martí, Céspedes, Maceo, and Gómez. By the 1930s, the Platt Amendment is finally repealed, but by then the pattern of dependence is deeply etched. The US still owns much of Cuba's economy, and political instability roils the republic. You walk through Havana's streets and sense both pride and disillusionment, an island still negotiating its place between dignity and domination. Yet beneath every disappointment the ember of resistance glows. It is there in every protest, every poem, every flag raised stubbornly in defiance. As you reflect, you realize that Cuba's independence is not a single event tied neatly to 1902, but a long, uneven journey stretching through wars, treaties, occupations, and revolutions. It is the story of an island that refused to stop demanding recognition even when empires tried to silence it. From the Grito de Yara in 1868 to Martí's writings, from Maceo's bronze resolve to the old veterans in Havana's parks, Cuba's struggle carved its identity as fiercely as machetes cut through cane. And now, in the stillness of a Caribbean evening, you picture the island at rest. The sun dips low over the Malecon, its light painting the sea in shades of amber and gold. The waves roll endlessly as they did when Spanish galleons once docked here, as they did when rebels marched through cane fields, as they still do now. You breathe in the salt air, heavy yet soothing, and understand that independence for Cuba has always been both victory and question, claimed in blood, compromised in treaties, tested again and again. So the story closes not with the roar of cannons, but with the quiet persistence of memory. The veterans fade, the parade's end, but the dream remains a Cuba wholly its own sovereign and unshadowed. And as the stars emerge over the island, blinking softly in the humid night, you let the sound of the waves carry you into calm. A whisper that independence, though imperfect, though unfinished, was never abandoned. Now the pace softens like dusk settling over a long day. You step away from the battlefields, the treaties, the flags rising and falling, and listen instead to the steady hush of the sea along Cuba's shores. The air cools, the hum of insects drifts in, and the island's long history begins to quiet itself, not erased, but resting. Think of all those voices, farmers singing softly after days in the cane fields, exiles writing in cramped rooms by candlelight, children clutching their elders' stories as though they were treasures. They are still there, woven into the island's very heartbeat, like a rhythm you can't quite forget. The images of war and loss blur, now replaced by gentler ones, an old man polishing a medal as his granddaughter plays nearby waves washing over footprints on a beach, a breeze carrying the faint smell of sugar and tobacco through quiet streets. These details remind you that independence is not only a matter of treaties or governments, but of memory, dignity, and the stubborn belief that tomorrow can be more free than today. As you let your breathing slow, picture the Cuban flag swaying gently, not in triumph, not in despair, but simply in endurance. Its colors fade in the night air, stars appearing overhead, each one a reminder of how many lives once lifted their eyes to the same sky, whispering prayers, vows, or even jokes under the moon. The long struggle recedes like a tide, leaving behind a calm shore. So let yourself rest with that image, an island quiet at last, its people still dreaming, its waves still singing. The story lingers, but it softens now, becoming a lullaby carried on Caribbean winds. And in that lullaby, you find peace.